Welcome to this week's Treasury Career Corner podcast, where I interview Treasury professionals about their Treasury careers. Each and every week, I'll talk to treasurers about how they built their careers, where they are now, where they see both themselves and the Treasury profession going to next. And a special thanks to Flywire, our fantastic sponsors. If you've ever wondered whether there was a way to ease your international transaction hassles, they're the guys to talk to. If you follow the link in our show notes, you can see me talking to my mate Greg Levin, their Senior VP of Sales. I get to ask Greg about who are Flywire and how they can help you and your Treasury team with your cross-border payment headaches. Just follow the link to the interview in today's show notes. And now, let's get on with the show. In this week's show, I'm joined by Hans Ljøen, the Head of Treasury and Investor Relations at Leroy Seafood. Leroy Seafood is a world-leading seafood corporation, history going all the way back to 1899. The core business is production of salmon and trout, white fish, processing, product development, marketing, sale, and distribution of seafood. Every single day, all year round, employees deliver seafood corresponding to 5 million meals. It's mental. Extensive range of healthy products served up 80 plus countries. The main office is in Bergen. They have fishing vessels and operations entire coast of Norway. But I'm going to get Hans to explain a little bit more about the corporation a bit later on in the group. Hans, I know we had a nice pre-chat the other day. If you would take us back to the beginning of your career, how you first discovered finance and then Treasury. Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike, for the very kind introduction and for the invitation. Yeah. And the way you explain Lerøy, you could work in investor relations at Lerøy, definitely.
There's vacancies. In between podcasts, I'll do it.
Yeah, exactly. And even your pronunciation of my last name, very good. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, anyways, back to your questions. How did I get into finance? I used to study finance for a starting point. I have a master's degree in finance from the leading business school in Norway. But my interest in perhaps not finance, but in business, it started much earlier than that. At the age of, say, 13, 14, I started reading business newspapers, and I found that interesting. And I've always had an interest in both saving money and earning money. That's always been an interest for me. So my way into finance in school, the topics that were of analytical nature interested me the most. When I graduated, my first idea was banking. Banking might be a good starting point. And when you're a student, you don't really know that much about work and what it's all about. But my first job ended up being in PW as an auditor and in consulting. It turned out to be a very valuable experience, also for pursuing a career in finance and banking later on. It wasn't my favorite job, to be honest. Auditing is a bit backward looking for me, and consulting was a bit too much processes and boxes and arrows, but still very valuable lessons. And being able to read financial accounts and understanding how they are prepared and learning different businesses and meeting with people in finance functions has turned out to be valuable in later roles in finance and in Treasury. So that's how it all started.
Yeah, it was a good start. And then you did a few years there and thought, time for the next move, or how did it come about that you were going to move up the partnership route there? What happened next?
Yeah, what happened next? So again, my first idea was that banking is probably for me. And I'm very much fascinated by the role of banks in society as infrastructure. In the same way that Treasury is infrastructure in a corporation, banks are infrastructure in society. And it's a lot of the work you do in banking is very analytically oriented, which resonate very well with my skill set and my interests. And I had the opportunity to work for some clients that were also clients of Nordea Bank, the leading Nordic bank. And that was my way into banking. I started as a credit analyst in the shipping offshore division of the bank, working with some of the same clients I had in auditing and consulting. So being a credit analyst for large corporates is a role where you really learn core skills that are useful in Treasury. You learn to do financial modeling in Excel. You learn to analyze P&Ls and balance sheets. You learn to analyze markets, corporations, understand risk management, you learn, it turned out later that the framework on how you approach risk management and how you learn and understand the company is very useful in treasury as well. But the key is to not get stuck in a very specialized position. And I worked exclusively towards shipping and offshore, and that is a niche.
Yeah.
But the framework is more applicable across different functions in corporations.
And you were there for quite a while. You did sort of 9 years or so, and an interesting period. So you really got into it and understanding. Did you start to get to know treasurers, finance teams, and things, really understand it?
Absolutely. After a couple of years, I transferred into a relationship role, so managing the relationship between the customers and the bank. And that's a bit different role from being an analyst. You become a discussion partner typically for the CFO if it's a medium-sized company, or a group treasurer if it's a smaller company. You get to learn their priorities, how they think and how they work, which is also very useful if you want to transfer into a role on the other side of the table.
Yeah.
You learn negotiations, you learn to carefully read loan agreements, you learn the different banking products that are used by corporates, also very useful. So I think if banking is a good platform for entering treasury, but with a big but, and that condition is that you work in a role that is sufficiently broad. If
Yeah.
you have a very narrow focused role, that might not be the best way to transfer into treasury at corporates later on.
And you and I, we spoke about this before, that I was saying that if I get someone from relationship side and they want to move into treasury, that's great because they have a better understanding as long as they're not too senior. But a lot of the time I get, say, a cash management guru, someone really knows cash and ins and outs of payments. And they say, oh, I want to move into treasury. I went, okay, when did you last do a treasury management system? When did you last understand what the levers were for a treasury? And they just don't understand, sort of thing. But that's a challenge. And so then you made a bit of an entrepreneurial leap, if you like, didn't you, as well? Talk us through the next couple of moves, because interesting sort of steps that you then took.
Yeah. So the next stage in my career was one that you can't really plan for. I got an opportunity that I, at that stage, perhaps didn't deserve, and that's called luck. I joined a startup, a bank startup, that is an online bank, no physical branches, at the stage where this was not a bank. They had no equity, no banking license. It were basically 15 PowerPoint slides and a group of people. So that had to go well, right? It was an interesting journey. I joined as Chief Risk Officer and Compliance. Again, I didn't deserve it, but in a matter of years, I did deserve the position, I think. What I learned from joining the bank, and there are many things I learned, but one thing is that you don't have to be an expert at everything. You can still cover a very broad role, because what you learn at school and at work is a way of solving problems, and that's universal. So you need to trust your own skill set, and you need to use your network to your advantage, discuss with people that you perhaps think have knowledge about the problems that you need to solve in your role. And that way you can develop into covering perhaps a more broad and much bigger role than you first anticipated. So don't be afraid to pursue opportunities when they arrive. Being on deep water is a good way of learning.
Yeah, and you learned a lot in the challenging times you went through there as well. How did that then prepare you for your latest role, or talk us through the sort of the transition sort of thing?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, before we get there, so what did I learn working for a startup? And I learned a lot of things. And one thing I already mentioned, so the ability to solve things you thought you were unable to solve. Everything has a solution. There's usually not a perfect solution, but you do the best you can with the resources and the time you have available. I was exposed to a lot of different situations and matters during the 5 or 6 years I spent at the Monobank. And if we focus on the finance side, I did anything from mergers and acquisitions, listing the company on the stock exchange in Oslo, entering new markets abroad, raising equity capital, raising bond capital, and so on. Cost cutting, expansions, and a lot of things that businesses are exposed to. So that gave me a very broad platform. And I also had a period as CFO and CEO of the company, where I led a restructuring of the company. But anyways, broad experience, which has been very useful later on. So my current role is a step down. It's a step down the career ladder. And how did that happen? And that's definitely by choice. So we have this thing called work-life balance, and the people who talk about work-life balance are usually people that don't have it. And the companies that talk about it is typically workplaces that don't have work-life balance. That is, it's unbalanced.
Yeah.
For a startup, you work a lot. It's a lifestyle. It's not a job in a normal sense. It's a lifestyle. And I wanted to spend more time at home.
Yeah.
I wanted to see the kids and my wife more, but still have an exciting work day. And I decided that Treasury, that would be such place for me. So that was my motivation. But actually transferring from C-level position and down into Treasury, that was quite difficult, because what I met when I applied for jobs is that the employer seemed to have a sense that perhaps this wasn't the end game.
Yeah.
This was just a stepping stone. But now, 4 years later, I've proven that I really wanted to do Treasury, because I really love the field and I love that part of banking as well. So that was basically the transition. Yeah.
Tell us about Leroy. I touched on that a little bit earlier. You're head of Treasury and Investor Relations. I'm not trying to steal your investor relations. You can keep that piece. That's fine. But talk us through who are the company, obviously well known in Norway, size and everything else.
So I think you covered it very well in your introduction. But what I can, since we have the audience we have,
Yeah.
I could talk a bit about the financials and the balance sheet. So
yeah, please
I'll
do.
be a treasurer and not talk about balance sheets, right? Turnover of around 2.5 billion euros annually, an EBIT of say 250 million euros, balance sheet of 3.5 billion euros, something like that. A listed company on Oslo Stock Exchange, 50 ratio. So if you look at the debt side, it's green financings and non-green financings. It's bonds, it's your regular revolving credit facilities, long-term facilities, overdraft facilities, and factoring, and so on. So we use the entire suite of banking products and capital markets as well.
Yeah.
So that's,
That's you. And then when you made that transition, again, is there someone 3 years before you, if you like, they're doing that transition now? They're moving from you're a bit more unusual than a lot of people. They're coming into that. What was it like for you joining? What tips would you give to someone?
Yeah, so these are perhaps a bit generic, but it has worked for me at least, is to hard work. That really works. And you hear a lot of talk about working smart and not hard. It works even better if you work both smart and hard. So that's been the key to my success, has been hard work. And throw yourself in deep waters. That's when you really learn. Being curious. Curiosity is a fantastic trigger for learning.
I tell you what, I wish I had, well, a pound for that every time I've heard it on the podcast. I think we've done 330 out of 330 pounds. I think it's mentioned every time that I think if we'll look at doing some ebooks at some stage based on that. I think it's just going to be called The Curious Treasurer. I think people might take it the wrong way, but it's true. It just gets you into so many interesting situations.
It does. It does. And one last thing, again, a bit generic, but if you get an opportunity, pursue it. So don't hesitate. Don't hesitate.
But digging a bit more into that, you've had this relationship side of banking, if you like, as well, in your back pocket, if you like. When you're managing your relationships with your banks, do they roll their eyes as you walk in the door and go, hang on, he knows exactly what we do? Do you, because you've got that understanding of the other side of the table, do you really find that helps you as a treasurer, would you say?
Yeah, it definitely does help, because we speak the same language.
Right.
So it definitely does help. But what I often do, because sometimes the bankers, they assume I know everything because I've had the roles I've had in the past, but that of course is not the case. So like earlier today, I had a meeting with a Dutch bank on cash pooling. And cash pooling structures can sometimes be a bit complex. So although I know some of the structures, I'm not an expert. There are people that knows cash management and cash pooling way better than me. So I said, assume I know just a little. So give me a 1 on what you're proposing and how it will affect me.
And as you say, coaching them in a good way.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
And you've come in, it's been 3 years. What have you seen? What have been key to your success, if you like? And again, we'd had this conversation before that there are a number of questions I usually ask, but there are some really good ones in here. Key to your success, career highlights so far. What has it been like?
Yeah. I'll let the CFO of Lerøy decide whether I've been a success or not, but at least I can tell a bit about what I've done and what we at Treasury are a bit proud about. When I joined Lerøy, I early discovered that our risk strategies and and measuring risk exposures aligned well with best practice. However, the execution and the processes leading to measuring risk or managing risk were less than perfect.
Right.
So we used to be very much spreadsheet based, and we are still to a quite large extent spreadsheet based. However, we have taken some important big steps towards systems supported treasury functions. And this might seem like a strange priority, but in fact, I did not start with a TMS project, which might seem like the very obvious thing to do when you're very spreadsheet based. But I didn't do that because I realized that we spent a lot of time on the number 2 risk we manage. I would say in treasury, it's always liquidity risk is number 1. The number 2 risk for Lerøy is currency risk. Yeah. So given that we have global operations, we have Norwegian kroner cost base, but our income is in foreign currency.
Yeah, everything. Yeah.
And if you plot the Norwegian kroner against the basket of key currencies together with our share price and together with our earnings, you would see a very strong correlation. So managing FX risk is really key. Yeah, a long answer, but I'm getting there soon, Mike.
No, it's lovely. It's the meat of the show sort of thing. And that's what I think other treasurers might have diversified risks in Asia Pacific. That's a big thing for them or stuff like that. As you say, for you, it's more, the meat and potatoes is actually, FX risk and the currency, because as you say, you trade so globally.
Exactly. So what I wanted to do is to change the process of how we manage. It was very manual based and we do a lot of trades every year. So every time we sell seafood on longer term contracts in foreign currency, we hedge that contract back to back. In the past, that process involved several systems. It involved people. Every time we did an FX hedge, it took something like 50 fields and systems that needed to be populated.
Yeah.
And it also meant that Treasury had to be available close to 24/7.
Yeah.
So we can close the gross margin for our salespeople. So then I started to look into, is there any way we can do this smarter? Again, I used to work for a neobank. So I took with me the mindset so the first thing we did then was to understand the entire sales process, and in particular, how the FX process really works. And when the process, only then you can design the optimal process that you want to support with the system, right? When we found what we think was the optimal way of doing this, we looked into 3 different system vendors that has developed software sitting between the ERP of the corporates and the multi-bank platforms where you trade FX. We ended up with an agreement with Seal FX, which is a Swedish fintech in the FX automation space. And today, the salespeople, when they sell fish, at the click of a button, they can be their own treasury manager. So basically, push of a button, they have traded the FX, so they know in our local currency what their earnings are. So it's quite fascinating. So if we sell seafood in Japan, which we do a lot, with weekly deliveries for 52 weeks. In 5 seconds and 1 click, we trade 52 forward contracts or 51 forward contracts and a spot contract in 5 seconds.
But you've then acted as you're not as the manager. You've guided them to this. They manage the risk, if you like, or you're managing the risk holistically, but they're actually sorting it out and doing the actual work in a way.
Yeah. And the next thing, and this is a topic that I find very important, and that is when you speak with software vendors, they say there's no risk because people are not involved and people make mistakes and systems don't. And that is correct, and it's entirely wrong as well. It's correct in the sense that systems don't make mistakes. They make mistakes because we ask software to do other things than we intended to. We have error in our programs, right? Our task is different now. We manage processes. We oversee systems and how they work. We validate inputs into the systems. We validate the output of the systems. So instead of spending our time executing an FX trade, we create business rules in the system to prevent errors from happening in the first place. For examples, so how do you prevent people from fat finger mistakes? Their intention is to trade 500,000 euros, but they ended up typing a zero too much, or they input a wrong currency, or the sign is the other way around. So how do you manage that type of risk? And that's an operational risk.
Yeah.
It makes us an operational risk manager more than a financial risk manager. We manage systems, and then you need to understand how systems work and how you manage them.
And also how you reference them. It brings me back. I had a meal ages ago with Johnson Controls, great guy. And he and I were talking about me giving a presentation, actually, that year's Eurofinance. We were going through about lots of different things about employees, candidates, and we were talking about that. And I was talking about his team. And he said, Mike, in a separate way, he said, look, if you're hiring someone, I'm hiring someone he has done through us, I'm going to reference them through 3 or 4 of their different employers or people they've worked with, make sure they're 100% on task and everything else. He said, do we do that for our systems? I was like, what? He said, do you go and talk to 3 or 4 of their past clients? Maybe you should. You go and do your RFP, you do everything else, and then actually, do you then check in with, okay, tell us, we represent these 3 other companies. Fantastic. What's been their experience? Yeah. It sounds like you've been through the similar thing as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Systems, obviously, we've got lots of stuff in the future. Where do you see Treasury developing? Obviously, there's lots of stuff, and then we're going to be at Eurofinance together. And actually, just on the TMS thing, we had Dirk, a recent guest on the podcast, and he was actually saying, Mike, it's all very well, everyone's going to be talking there about AI and automation and robotics. He said, but some people don't even know how to switch on their TMS. Some of them don't use all the modules. It's not properly implemented. Maybe we should go back to basics before we do the advanced class. I was like, okay, great. What do you see as coming up, or what are the things that you're thinking about?
I think it's an interesting perspective, by the way. Back to the basics.
I love it.
What are your building blocks, basically? And you have your building blocks in place before you pursue AI and cash forecasting, right? It sounds fantastic, and I'm sure it can be fantastic as well. But how do you manage your building blocks?
Yeah.
So you should always start with the infrastructure. Sometimes I think you can easily be a bit fascinated by what vendors are telling you is possible, right? And who doesn't want to use machine learning and AI? And you could say the same about robotics, although I would say robotics is, when do you use robotics? It's basically when systems don't speak together. So it's a symptom of a failed system landscape more than something to brag about. But it can be cost efficient. It's not really the perfect solution. But anyways, back on topic. Yeah, I know I guess my view is quite conventional here. I guess all of us, we are on journey on how to automate and how to have system support for key processes. But what I think is really important is to do that step back and think carefully through where you can really add value to the business. And that's another topic which is very popular at these conferences. you should start with looking at the processes that can not only save you time, but that which will be perceived by the business as valuable. And that was also an important motivation when we looked into automation of FX risk, because what we got in return is a sales force which is much more happy with how Treasury manage FX risk.
Yeah.
It has value to the business because they can lock their gross margin. So yeah, business orientation, that's a trend, and that will continue to be important. I'm very curious about how AI can improve Treasury. In particular, where I think it will have big value is in short-term cash forecasting. I'm less optimistic about longer-term forecasting because that process is less homogeneous. But short-term, driven by accounts receivable, accounts payable, that is perfect for machine learning.
Yeah.
And of course, anything on connections between us and using the AI, where we do not have a lot of use cases is on predictive analytics. We spend a lot of time on putting numbers together so you can get a nice table with some frequencies and some trends. But how do we use that information to make predictions that can make recommendations for what actions to take? And that part, I think, we're on a less mature stage.
Yeah, and that will come in the future as well. Go back to Treasury itself, and what do you find that you enjoy most about Treasury? Well, you've been there, as you said, you've got that balance back, but when you're in Treasury, what's making you go, I love this? And I know you've got a sort of team of 10 people. So when you're talking to that team, what are you coaching them on? What are they enjoying?
Yeah, what gets me up in the morning, and I think that goes for much of the team as well, is improving the business. So it's improving the business. And that goes back to what we have just discussed on the technology journey that so many of us are on that journey. Yeah, that's a big motivation, improving the business with focus on where we can add business value.
We're not quite at the end of the show, but you know what, again, from that, if someone's listening today, and again, we talked about it before the show, you've got more junior people across all stages, but why would you say that people, if you reflect on it and we had some time, why should someone pursue a career in Treasury? Why is it so much fun?
Yeah. So I like to start with, why do we exist? Why do we exist? Because I feel at least it's a big motivation to work with something that is critical for the business.
Yeah.
And Treasury is critical infrastructure. Unless you have a good Treasury operation, unless you manage your liquidity risk in a proper manner, you will not be able to withstand bad times. And if you can't pay your bills, there's no business for the owners. There's no business for us as people working for the business. So that's one motivation. And it puts us in a place also to pursue investments when our competitors are not. That's how, if you manage your balance sheet carefully, you can invest when opportunities are really there. So that's the Treasury part of it. And the second part would be, if you like technology and if you want to make an impact on a business, look no further, because that's exactly the journey that you're on in Treasury, applying newer technology to improve our business processes.
It's interesting. Sorry, we talk about collaboration in Treasury. You and I talked about how Treasury is collaborative with hybrid working and everything else. But actually, that's a new one. Actually, I'm not really thought about Treasury and your competitors. Actually, your Treasury team, we're going to be meeting up, and there's going to be lots of shared value with lots of different treasurers. But it's an interesting one. If you've got a more efficient Treasury, you're going to be better than, say, you're in two telecoms companies. One's got a really efficient cash system and everything else, and one's got inefficient payments and everything else. That could actually hit the bottom line. I don't think it's been as linked as it's becoming, maybe. Would you say so?
Yeah, makes sense. That makes sense.
Okay, time-wise, we're approaching this. So we're going to put your LinkedIn details in the show notes so people can connect to you. And again, they'll see you at Eurofinance and some of your sessions. What tips are you going to give to people, or what are the takeaways that you think, if you were listening, you've had a couple of the shows yourself, what are the things you think people should be focusing on?
But yeah, if you're referring to making a move into Treasury or moving up the ladder in Treasury, I would say that goes back to the tips that we discussed a couple of minutes ago. So work hard. That's number one.
Be curious.
Yeah. Be curious. Make sure you develop your technology skills.
Right.
If you don't know how to program, at least make sure you learn how systems work and how business processes are designed.
Yep.
Your analytical skills that you will always need. Make sure you don't specialize too early.
Yeah.
Make sure you don't specialize too early.
Those are for the junior guys, but for the more senior treasurers, and we're going to be in a room with 2,000 of them. What are you thinking they need to be thinking about? I've sometimes spoken to people and we touched on FX, we touched on different things. What do you think they should be preparing for? Some of your peers as well, that maybe they're not doing so well, and you think, actually, guys, you need to be looking at this in your rear view mirror as well.
Yeah. At least two things. One thing would be your team and the composition of your team. What type of skills do you have?
Right.
So I heard a guy at, I think it was last year's Eurofinance, if it wasn't Treasury 360, saying that your next hire should be a data scientist. And that resonated very well with my thinking. So that's basically a new skill set, which has been becoming increasingly important in our field. And the second would be to, when you modernize your treasury, take a step back and look at all the critical financial risks you manage and carefully review your process, and don't dive into automation too early. Understand the processes and make priorities. You can't do everything at once. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay. And any final words? Just the closing sentence. Sometimes I don't want it to be from me. I want it to be from my guests. Any final tips from anyone listening today?
Yeah. So my final thing would be to enjoy the learning experience. Enjoy the learning experience while we are improving our companies.
Fantastic. Amazing. Great to chat to you. And I'm going to see you in real life in a week. So yeah, look forward to seeing you over a beer or several. All right. Thanks very much. So it's been great to chat.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Hello, Treasury professionals. Before you dive into the next episode, could you please help me continue to grow the world's only global Treasury salary survey? That's right, our one. So you know your compensation is constantly benchmarked against the market. It's amazing, isn't it? Just go to treasurysalary.com. It takes less than 2 minutes to complete, start to finish. You then gain exclusive, regular, updated access to our salary survey, keeping you ahead of the curve. The survey is an evolving, breathing entity that constantly tracks the salaries of Treasury professionals on a global basis. Currently, we have over 1,100 participants taking part at treasurysalary.com. Thank you for being such amazing loyal listeners. Your support is incredible. Couldn't do it without you. Thank you. Go to treasurysalary.com.